Hey guys, let's continue on with discussing our waves, shall we? All right, so first thing we want to do is characterize waves a little bit more thoroughly into two different types, and that would be transverse and longitudinal. Just a few more definitions for you. So a transverse wave. A transverse wave is where the disturbance is perpendicular to the direction of the wave propagation. So a wave is moving this way, but the disturbance is made by going up and down. Okay, that might sound a little weird, but a good example would help. How about a stadium wave? If you've ever been in a stadium, sometimes people start up with a woo, and if you get a big group doing it and the people on either side see that, when they go like that, the people next to them then go like that, and you get a stadium wave going through. Well, the stadium wave is going this way, around the stadium. When the stadium wave gets to you, what do? You go up and down. In other words, the disturbance is perpendicular to the direction of wave travel. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? All right, some other examples of transverse wave. So we have stadium wave. What other examples do we have? Well, an electromagnetic wave is exactly a transverse wave. All right? So the electromagnetic wave, in other words, light and all its close brothers, radio waves up to gamma rays, all of those are transverse waves. We could think of a water wave, and now a water wave is really a combination of both transverse and longitudinal, and in water, particle really makes a circle because of that. But the way you see a water wave is much more a transverse wave. While it's certainly not exactly a transverse wave, it sure looks like one. So I'm going to put water 2 as an example of that, although we know it's not perfect. In earthquake waves, the S wave also would be a transverse wave, all right, for seismic waves. So that's an S wave. The secondary wave, or compression, or the wave, the shear wave, where things move up and down. That's why it doesn't go through liquid. Because if the side of a rock wall goes up and down, that's not going to transmit a wave into liquid. Only a wave moving back and forth, a compressional wave, would transmit it into liquid. So those are some ideas on what a transverse wave is. The other kind of wave is a longitudinal wave. And in this, the disturbance is parallel to the wave travel. So we don't do stadium waves that way. In class, I've sometimes gotten the kids to do that. That's kind of fun. And the way you do that, you move this way, you move back and forth when the wave comes by you. So you see the wave coming, the wave gets you, you just move back and forth, and then the people next to you move back and forth, and the wave goes that way. We've never seen a stadium wave like that. Pretty much just happens in a physics class. But if you could hear my voice, a sound wave would be an example of that. Sound wave is a compressional wave. Okay, when the tines on the tuning fork, when I hit that, it makes the sound because the tines on the fork are vibrating back and forth. When they vibrate this way, they compress the air right next to it, and that sends it off. When they pull back, they rarefy the air next to it, and that is also sent off. So a compressional wave is a longitudinal wave. Sound is really the best example, but we were talking seismic waves, and which wave of the seismic waves is a compressional wave? That would be the P wave. Okay, and a very weird stadium wave, if you could ever get them doing it, which, no, don't even bother. So that would be transverse and longitudinal waves. We divide waves up like that. And it's important to think about that because that's how the wave is being propagated. Is the disturbance up and down that's propagating through or side to side? Okay, so transverse and longitudinal. The next thing I want to talk about is what controls the wave speed in a medium. Now I'm going to do a lab on that I'll make a video of or do my best at because it's a challenging one to make a video of. But what controls the wave speed in a medium? All right, do we have some examples in real life? Well, imagine if frequency controlled the wave speed in a medium. So you're now listening to an orchestra from some distance. Excuse me, somebody playing like a piccolo or a flute or a high-pitched instrument. Does the sound get to you first from them? And somebody playing the kettle drum, a very low sound would get to you after when the two people are playing simultaneously? What would the music sound like if that was the case? No, you know, if you're in the audience, high-pitched and low-pitched gets to you at the same time. Furthermore, does amplitude or loudness make a difference? Well, if that was the case, somebody playing quietly, that would go slower maybe, and somebody playing loudly goes fast. Again, when you listen to an orchestra, it would sound completely out of sync. And yet from a distance, it doesn't. Everything is perfectly in place there. So what we realize when we're thinking of that is neither frequency nor amplitude make a difference when you're having a wave go through a medium. If a grenade goes off here and somebody whispers to me from there, and it's the same distance, both those sounds will get to me at the same moment. I'll probably be more interested in the grenade at that point, although somebody might have been whispering to me to duck, so maybe I should have listened there. But the sound would actually get to me at the same time. So what controls then the wave speed in a medium? And the answer is sort of funny. The medium controls the wave speed in the medium. You cannot make the sound go faster unless you change the medium. So I'll show you that in the lab. And it brings up the question of when a guitar player tunes the guitar, when they're turning a knob, what are they doing? Well, they would say they're tuning a guitar. How exactly are you tuning the guitar? By tightening the string. Well, you're changing the velocity at which the wave goes through. The wavelength is held constant because the wavelength is controlled by the length of the string. So if you are changing the velocity, then you're also changing the frequency. So that's how you're tuning a guitar. It's when you tighten the string, you're increasing the velocity at which a wave will propagate down that string. You're actually changing the medium that a string really is. If you loosen it or tighten it, that's a very different medium. Similarly, air. What would change air? The big change that makes a huge difference with air is temperature. And I'll show you some examples of how changing temperature messes with the sound traveling through air and causes it to bend or refract. So we'll get into that a little bit later. Now we want to talk about what happens to waves at boundaries, because this is pretty interesting. So at a boundary, let's consider a boundary here. You got that? Here's a boundary. All right, now a wave is moving towards the boundary. What happens when it gets to the boundary? Well, let's make up a hypothetical boundary. All right? So right down the middle of the room here, I'm calling it a boundary. I'm saying this is medium B, this is medium A. Here comes a sound wave or any kind of wave, and it hits the boundary and moves on. Well, I'm calling this a boundary, but we know it's really not. So it brings up the question, how different is the air there versus the air here? And you realize there's no difference. So what happens? Does any of that sound bounce off this boundary? Well, no, because there's really no boundary. In other words, if medium here is very similar to the medium here, most of the wave will pass into the new medium. So if I have, say, foam here, very light, airy foam, what will happen now as the wave gets to this boundary? Well, based on what we were just talking about, most of the wave should pass into the new boundary, right? Or into the new medium across the boundary. What if I have concrete here, like the concrete on the side of the walls? Is that very similar to the air in the room? I think we would agree it's not. So when a wave gets to a very different medium, most of the wave bounces off. Okay, so right away we can start using this. For a boundary then, very similar. Most is transmitted through. Very different. Well, very different. Most is reflected back at us. So at a boundary, two different things can happen. Some of the wave is transmitted, some of it is reflected. The more similar the boundary is, the more is transmitted. The more different, the more is reflected. So let us think of a time when you don't want a lot of sound coming back. If you were in, say, a recording studio, you want what you're singing or playing to get into the microphone and be done, get into the electronics and be done. So you do not want the room echoing back. That in general is not going to make a better sound. You want the sound direct, and then you can modify it electronically. So what is on the wall of a recording studio? Well, if you've ever seen one, foam. They have a lot of foam on the walls of a recording studio. If they have some sort of chamber where they're trying to absorb all the sound, an anechoic chamber, for example, and I'm going to link a video Veritasium made, which is wonderful, on what it's like to be in this chamber that absorbs all the sound. It supposedly will drive you crazy, and I don't think it really drives you crazy. But it is weird to be in a place that's entirely quiet. And it is, because sound can neither get in nor get out. But more importantly, if you generate a sound, it's absorbed by the walls. The foam kind of stuff on the wall absorbs it. Okay, great. When the foam absorbs it, it turns into low-grade heat and you're done with it. What if it's reflected, though? What if it's reflected? So if it's very different and it's reflected, if it's a more rigid boundary, something interesting happens. And let me try to draw this for you, because this becomes important when we're talking standing waves, which are going to be very important in our physics discussions. So when we have a boundary situation, I'm going to be making a wave coming in. All right. Now, we have to accept something right away. I'm really trying to draw a sound wave, but a sound wave are compressional waves. So I'm trying to draw that, well, with a transverse wave. Why? Well, imagine this would be an area of rarefaction, and this would be an area of compression. Okay. It's very hard to draw those things and make sense out of it. So we use generally a transverse wave to make sense out of this. And what we're doing is we're saying the low amplitude is equal to a rarefaction, the high amplitude is equal to compression. Through that, we can make sense of it. I got to tell you, it's really hard to easily make sense of these things otherwise. So in this situation, when it hits a more rigid boundary, something odd happens. Its phase is inverted 180 degrees. And if you remember phase discussions, what that means, the reflected wave coming off of this is going to come back like that. So the wave gets to a more rigid spot and then is inverted and then starts its way back. Well, on its way back then, if you continue making waves, the waves are going to meet in such a way that here you'll have an antinode vibrating between positive and negative displacements. as you'll have here, these should be the same size if I'm being a good person. So here's another antinode vibrating up and down. But here, right here, is a node. Right there is a node. Now I want you to see what's happening in a node. Until you study waves, this has always been impossible. You've seen it a lot, but it's impossible unless you understand waves. Because this up wave is meeting the down wave, and the up meeting the down cancels the wave out completely. So the node has no motion, even though waves are passing right through it. But right at the nodal point, you have an up and a down perfectly canceling. And then the wave moves on, and you have this up and down thing. This is a standing wave, and the wave will just sit there wobbling between top and bottom with a node right there. And if you vibrate it more, you can make more antinodes, and thus more nodes too, sitting on the same string or spring or whatever you're using. Mr. Clark and I are going to demonstrate a standing wave for you in a little bit on another video. So on a reflection, you will get some of the wave coming back. If it's a more rigid boundary, it'll invert the wave that's coming back. If it's a less rigid boundary, it will not invert the wave coming back. If the boundary is very similar, very little will come back at all. And if it's very different, you'll get a lot coming back. Well, this allows us to mess with your poor heads a little bit. Let's try something. All right, so we got to think about these. And this is this is one of the more challenging things, but you'll catch on pretty quickly, I suspect. So, we have some possibilities. Sent and received. Sent and received. If I send out a large upward pulse, and I get back a large upward pulse, what does that mean? Furthermore, if I send out a large upward pulse and get back a small inverted pulse, okay? Well, you can see there's two other possibilities here, all right? I send out a large upward pulse, I get back a small upward pulse. I send out a large upward pulse, and I get a large inverted pulse. Okay, so now we have to think about what would do all of these things. If a large upward pulse comes back, first of all, was it inverted? No, it was not inverted. So is it more rigid or less rigid? Okay, so we could tell about the boundary. The boundary then, it did not invert it. So it's less rigid. Now, did most get transmitted or did most come back? Well, most came back. So is the boundary, is that material it's being transmitted to very different or very similar? Well, if it was very similar, most would be transmitted. That's not what happened. So it's very different. So we would say very less rigid. You get the hang of this? I send out a pulse. It is inverted, so we know it's more rigid. But did we get much back? No, most of it got transmitted. So is it very more rigid or slightly more rigid? Well, most got transmitted, so it's slightly more rigid. Slightly more rigid. All right, can you do the other two on your own here? All right, this up pulse went out, and a tiny up pulse came back. So think about it. Did it get inverted? No. What does that mean? Didn't get inverted. So what's the boundary like? If it didn't get inverted, we know it's less rigid. But, okay, so you might as well put that down, less rigid. Did most get transmitted or most get reflected? Most got transmitted. That's why you only got a little reflection. So is that boundary very different or slightly different? Right? If most got transmitted, slightly less rigid. You could abbreviate that. How about this one? Most of the wave came back, right? And it's inverted. So what would we say there? Is the boundary very different? Mm-hmm. Is it more rigid? Mm-hmm. So we'd say very more rigid. Isn't that wonderful? You really got to think these things through. I know for myself, there's no way to memorize that. You really just got to piece it together every time. So this is what happens at boundaries. We use this all the time. When we look at our theater in our lovely high school here, we see an acoustically beautiful room. And using these ideas, you could start understanding how we go about manipulating the sound there. There are places we want to bounce the sound to give you a surrounding effect where you feel embraced by the sound. That's a nice feeling if it's good sound. Instead of just one direction, you feel the warmth of the whole room sending sound around you. Awesome. But once we're done sending the sound around you, now what do we want to do with it? Well, we want to kill off that sound. We don't want that sound echoing and echoing and echoing. That is not a pleasant room to be in. So we have reflective ways of messing with the sound using hard surfaces. And then we have absorptive waves using soft surfaces. So with a combination of these things, we get the sound to surround you, embrace you, and then disappear and stop bothering you. So we use this all the time. Certainly when we're tapping somebody with radar, especially I'm sure military radar, that signal that comes back is interpreted carefully, and they can tell a lot about the signal that comes back just by looking at ideas like this, right? So that's pretty cool. Let's talk about something we were inferring before, but we need to really get a handle on, because this is very powerful as well. Wave interference, okay? Yeah, bells are going off for me too. So wave interference. So interference. How does this work? Well, we have two kinds. We have constructive and destructive interference, and they're funny. All right, so consider the easiest way to represent it is with two pulses of equal amplitude. So this is going to be constructive. Two pulses of equal amplitudes heading towards each other. So we have wave A, we have wave B, and they are inbound. And in the next diagram, we indicate what happens when they meet. So what happens when they meet is the amplitudes add. You add the amplitudes together. So when you add the amplitudes here, this would be then A plus B. They were both in the up direction, so you're piling them on top of each other. I think one of the more interesting parts about this is after they meet and they head off, check this out. So here is A continuing, here is B continuing. They are unaffected by their meeting. They meet, superimpose each other on themselves, and then just continue. This is called superposition, when they're both meeting and they have these very high amplitudes. So when do you need to know about this? Well, in a whole lot of situations, but one that I was part of some years ago. I had some friends of mine up on a lake up in upper New York State. They were in a canoe, they were fishing. They should have been paying attention to this. A kid in a speedboat, just goofing around, went around them at a fair distance. So the kid in the speedboat, I'm betting, didn't have physics, or maybe just wasn't paying attention. But the kid in the speedboat went around them 3 times in the speedboat at a substantial distance. Do you need to worry if that's the case? Well, yeah. The waves from that speedboat, small as they are now inbound to you from all directions, not just 2 directions, from all directions, because that circle is generating waves that are coming to you from all directions. And when those waves get to you, craziness erupts. They were flipped right out of their canoe. The waves met and had such a large superposition amplitude that they were flipped out of their canoe. And they were in really bad straits because the water was very cold. Anybody running a boat should really understand what happens when waves do this. I'm in my kayak fairly often on a lake, and I'll have speedboats pass on one side and another, both port and starboard. Speedboats will pass by me, and if they're evenly spaced from me, maybe 100 feet off starboard, 100 feet off port, well, I have a problem, because those waves are now inbound to me. And in a short time, right where I am, very large waves are going to appear. So if I'm kitted out in my kayak in a way that is happy with big waves, I'm going to have some fun. But if I have my cockpit completely open and all my stuff is right there and I'm not anticipating having big waves come into the boat, I could have a problem. So what do I do? What do you do if you're in that situation? All right? Well, first of all, you realize it, and then you need to turn one way or the other quickly. Get out of the center part of that, and then you'll be okay. But look over at the center and you'll see what I'm talking about, because those waves get pretty large. So that's constructive interference. And now let's talk about destructive interference and the fun you can have with destructive interference. So similarly, you have A heading in, but now B is the opposite. So while A has an up amplitude, B has the negative, the down amplitude. What happens when they meet? Well, if their amplitudes are the same distance above as they are below, a very odd effect ensues. So this is A plus B, because B would be a negative number. You cancel it out. That's bizarre. You have no resulting effect on the water. And of course, when it's all done, you have B heading off and A heading off as if they were unaffected by that completely. So when do we use this? Well, we can use this in a number of interesting situations. There are now devices called active noise canceling headphones, and I suspect a number of you have played with them. When you take an active noise canceling headphone, you have your earpiece So if this is the earpiece here, all right, there's the speaker on it. Right, you have somewhere here a microphone. That microphone picks up the sound coming in from your outside external world, sends it to the amplifier, amplifies the sound, and then it does one more thing. It inverts the phase 180 degrees. And it times this all so this sound that has just gotten to here, by the time it gets to the microphone, let's think about what a short distance that is and how fast the electronics must be working, which for electronics is easy. By the time it gets to the microphone, that sound wave, the microphone produces the sound completely 180 degrees out of phase with that. So what do you hear? Nothing. You're able to electronically turn off the sound around you. Now, it generally doesn't work perfectly, but if you've ever tried these, you know with just flipping a switch, all of a sudden the world gets much quieter. That's bizarre, but that's exactly what's happening. It'll also show up on your stereo. If you play a single tone, now it works all the time on your stereo, but if you play a single tone over 2 speakers, you will find a place, if you move your head back and forth, especially if you close one ear and just move one ear in line with the speakers, just go back and forth, you'll quickly find a place where the sound goes down to almost 0 because you're having a crest and a trough meet at that spot, and it'll be a dead zone. And a little bit distant from that, you'll find the music is, or the tone is much, much louder. So you're getting alternate constructive and destructive interference right there, playing with sound. So these things play out in the real world in interesting ways. A jackhammer on a road crew is considered one of the most obnoxious sounding devices ever. And supposedly now they're developing jackhammers that have a speaker on it, a really loud speaker, that produce, because the noise is coming from one spot, it can produce a sound exactly out of phase with the noise being produced, and thus make the jackhammer much quieter for the world around it. Pretty cool. So an example of destructive interference. Okay? Well, I think that's it for this one. And I'll see you on the next one. Oh, no, I want to show you one more thing. Can I show you this? I think you can see this pretty well. So check this out. All right, I'm going to lower the camera here. All right. So this wavetable has been making so much noise while I try to make these videos. See if you can't see what I'm